No one expected the new images to look like this. For weeks, NASA, ESA and the Deep Space Network had been quietly preparing the public for refined imaging of 3I Atlas, a vague phrase meant to soften the shock of the truth that was coming. Analysts whispered about a density anomaly. A few astronomers hinted at an unusual vent near the core. But when the first enhanced frame arrived from the L2 telescope array, the room went silent. Because right there, drawn across space like a razor-thin scar, was a jet. Not wide, chaotic, or explosive like a comet's natural outgassing plume. This one was narrow, focused, directed, as if it wasn't leaking, but pointing. And that single line of impossibly collimated vapour changed the entire story. If you're the kind of mind this channel was built for, before you go, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now while you're diving into this mystery. Hit subscribe, give this video a like, and help us push this investigation into the algorithm so more people can join this hunt. The image didn't behave. At normal exposure, the jet nearly disappeared, a faint filament of polarized light barely 1 pixel thick. But when researchers pushed the dynamic range to its upper limit, the structure emerged in terrifying clarity, a needle-straight projection emerging from deep inside 3I Atlas, thinner than any natural vent ever recorded, maintaining alignment despite rotation, solar wind, and gravitational drift. If the jet were a natural release of volatiles, a standard cryogenic outburst from a sublimating nucleus, it should have fanned outward with distance. It should have scattered under solar pressure. It should have dispersed like all comet jets do, but it didn't. This one sharpened, almost like a beam. NASA's internal notes referred to it as a photonic edge plume, a term no one outside of deep field optics had ever heard. It meant the jet wasn't just matter, it was interacting with light in a way that created a defined boundary, a crisp edge, like a laser grazing fog. The first meeting about the anomaly lasted 7 hours, engineers argued. Physicists swore the angle couldn't hold under rotation. Plasma specialists insisted the plume should curve under solar wind. But the jet didn't curve. It remained straight, it remained aligned, and in every time-stamped frame, the direction stayed locked onto the same point in space. Not toward the Sun, not toward Jupiter, not even toward Earth. The jet pointed toward nothing. And that's what frightened them most. Because objects in motion do not waste energy. They do not produce structure without purpose. They do not maintain impossible precision in a regime ruled by chaos, unless something inside them is regulating that precision. The second image released, the one that the agencies refused to comment on publicly, revealed the base of the jet in unprecedented resolution. Instead of emerging from a typical fracture or pressure-filled vent, the plume originated from a depression shaped like a perfect ellipse. The edges were smooth, too smooth to be natural, polished by some process unknown to planetary science. Inside that ellipse, analysts detected a faint internal glow. It wasn't reflected sunlight, it wasn't thermal, it wasn't scattering. It pulsed, very slowly. At a rhythm matching the object's internal cycles observed months earlier. The same rhythm that had already defied physics, already challenged models, and already driven fragments of the scientific community into quiet, career-saving silence. The pulse synchronized with a deep core anomaly recorded earlier that month, so when the directed jet appeared for the first time, several researchers immediately recognized what they were seeing. This wasn't a plume, it was an outlet. A channel connected to something deeper, something timing itself, something regulating its emissions, something selecting the moment the jet would appear. Theories spiraled out of control within hours. It's a structural fissure being shaped by rotation, one planetary geologist argued. No fissure holds that shape, the plasma physicist beside him muttered. It's a magnetic field artifact, someone else suggested. But magnetic fields don't carve matter into perfect lines. They're imaging reflections from inside the core, another insisted. Yet reflections don't travel tens of kilometers into open space with zero divergence. Someone asked the question no one wanted to say aloud. If it's not natural, then what is it? The room fell silent again. Outside the public view, internal messages circulated rapidly between NASA laboratories, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, ESA's Optics Division, and the International Gravitational Sensor Network that had recently picked up low-amplitude pulses from 3I Atlas. Those pulses, the quiet heartbeat in the object's core, aligned perfectly with the jet's periodic intensification. Every time the pulse rose, the jet brightened. Every time the pulse faded, the jet dimmed, as if they were connected. More disturbingly, the jet wasn't just visible, it was measurable. Particle counters detected a moderated stream of ions leaving the base of the jet with a velocity far too stable for natural expulsion. A standard jet would have bursts, turbulence, pressure spikes. But this one, this razor-thin plume, behaved more like a controlled stream. It maintained constant volume, constant direction, constant strength. That's when someone finally said what the data had been screaming. It looks like a propulsive element. The room erupted again. It cannot be propulsion, one engineer insisted. There's no lateral recoil. Not if the recoil is internal, someone else whispered. No exhaust. Signature, another pointed out. Unless the exhaust is non-visible, it doesn't accelerate the object. Maybe it's not meant to. As theories collided, a subtle shift in the readings silenced all arguments. The jet was moving, not drifting, not wobbling, not randomly adjusting with rotation. The base of the beam, the elliptical cavity, was slowly pivoting, not around the object's axis, but independent of it. As 3i Atlas spun, the jet subtly compensated, adjusting its angle to maintain a fixed position against the background stars. The jet wasn't following the rotation, it was stabilizing against it, and that was the moment the last natural explanation died. No comet, asteroid, or interstellar fragment has ever shown behavior capable of counter-rotational stabilization. It requires energy input, it requires sensing, it requires reaction, it requires intent. That single realization forced one final question. What is it pointing at? To answer that, astronomers synchronized hundreds of images into a sequence and traced the line of the jet millions of kilometers forward. The plume cut through space in a straight geometric path, intersecting nothing known, nothing mapped. But when they extended the projection further, far beyond the solar system, pushing the model decades into the object's trajectory, a chill swept through the room. The jet was pointing toward a location outside the solar neighborhood, a coordinate with no catalogued star, no known structure, but with one strange historical note. It matched the backward traced position of an unidentified radio burst recorded in 2014, a burst no agency had ever explained, a burst that had been dismissed as noise, a burst that now, a decade later, suddenly made sense. The directed jet wasn't pointing forward, it was pointing home. The idea landed like a physical blow, not a thruster, not a vent, a signal, a marker, a beacon, a thread of matter and energy, so faint that only enhanced imaging could reveal it, slicing across the void toward a destination humanity had buried in old mission logs. The truth became unavoidable. 3i Atlas had sent something back, not a message in radio, not a broadcast in light, not a signature in magnetism, something else, something directed, something thin enough to hide until now. NASA sealed the meeting transcripts, ESA redacted the data feed, and the next public release was delayed without explanation. But in the quiet rooms where the unedited images were viewed, one whispered thought repeated again and again. If this is a beacon, who is it for? No one had an answer. No one wanted one. But the thin, perfect line of the jet kept pointing, unwavering, unbroken, impossibly precise, toward a place in the galaxy where silence no longer felt like silence. It felt like waiting. The first analysis run should have ended the conversation. A thin jet is unusual. Directed thin jet is impossible, and a directed thin jet that doesn't disperse, that doesn't widen, doesn't arc, doesn't obey the behavior of volatile gas escaping a fractured nucleus. That's not just anomalous. That's engineered. NASA's second pass through the high contrast frame sharpened the truth. The jet didn't emerge like an eruption. It extended, unbroken, from a single microscopic vent only 14 meters wide, a precision more consistent with a machined aperture than a naturally fractured outgassing seam. The beam held a straight, unwavering line for more than 800 kilometers, slicing through the comet's own coma like a needle through fog, undisturbed by dust, ice, or solar wind. This wasn't a burst, it was a beamline. Even stranger, The jet wasn't aligned with thermal hotspots. It wasn't coming from the warmest region. It wasn't aligning with 3 axes of rotation. It wasn't reacting to solar heating. It was oriented toward a fixed point in space, a point 3I Atlas had silently tracked for days. Not toward the Sun, not toward Jupiter, not toward Earth, but toward empty space. At least that's what it looked like at first. The outflow itself wasn't random vapor. Spectroscopy revealed something unthinkable. The jet carried a narrow mix of crystalline silicate fragments, boron glass particulates, and a microlayer of ionized metallic dust arranged into a uniform particle density. It was as if the object wasn't venting material, it was printing something. The composition formed a stable filament, a tether of matter that behaved nothing like natural cometary exhaust. Normal plumes widen exponentially as they escape. This one didn't widen at all. It held thickness with less than 2.1% deviation, even across hundreds of kilometers. That shouldn't happen in vacuum. It shouldn't happen anywhere. But the alignment was the part that changed everything. NASA rotated the starfield reference and finally saw it. The line was pointing not into emptiness, but directly toward a region of deep space interference, an ultra-faint radio dark zone detected only twice in the last decade. A zone that had been dismissed as instrumentation error. Now it wasn't error. Something was there. Something 3I Atlas was reaching toward. The beam flickered, not chaotically, rhythmically. A pulse repeated every 63 seconds, as if the jet itself carried timing information encoded in density, heat, or ionization. It was signaling, not broadly, not randomly. It was signaling directionally, and every pulse sharpened the filament even more. But what the JAXA imaging team found next forced NASA to lock the raw data behind 3 access layers. At the base of the jet, small eddies of matter weren't escaping. They were circling, recoiling, pulled inward before being accelerated outward again, a closed-loop flow, a pump. The comet was not bleeding, it was feeding a jet system. Pressure readings confirmed that the internal force required to sustain the jet exceeded natural cavern pressures by a factor of 11.2, far beyond what a fractured comet nucleus could withstand without exploding. Yet 3I Atlas stayed stable, silent, calm. The images showed no cracking, no thermal stress, no rotational instability. This wasn't a natural leak. It was a controlled emission, a nozzle, a vector. And then the part no one expected. The jet moved. Not bent, not deflected. It reoriented. A shift of 7 degrees in under 3 seconds. No natural vent could do that. No pressure pocket could pivot like a turret. No outgassing event could change direction with such mechanical clarity. 3I Atlas wasn't venting, it was aiming. The entire scientific community paused, not because they understood the mechanism, they didn't, but because the movement wasn't random drift or surface fracturing, it was deliberate. The jet pointed toward a new point in space, another coordinate, a second dark region, a trajectory offset from the first by exactly 19.4 degrees. NASA mapped the angular separation, a line formed, then another. Both converged behind the comet's past trajectory, a path that 3I Atlas had travelled years ago, a path that led out of the solar system and back toward the deep, cold void between stars. The object wasn't sending a jet into space, it was drawing, not graffiti, not markings, a path, a line of direction, a reference, a coordinate track. Whatever 3I Atlas was pointing at, whatever it was triangulating, it was behind it, not ahead. As if something was following, or something was supposed to. The jet brightened for a moment, a luminous needle-thin band so straight it looked artificial, even in the unprocessed raw imaging. The beam flickered again, but this time the pulse wasn't steady. This time it carried modulation, a 3-phase density change. Low, high, low, repeating. JPL ran the simplest possible comparison. 3 modulations, 3 beats, 3 intervals. Not a coincidence. A pattern mirrored in instrument pings used by deep space probes to identify their origin. This wasn't a natural plume. This was an identification broadcast, a cosmic address, a beacon. The jet wasn't a weapon. It wasn't propulsion. It wasn't venting. It was a directed signal system strapped onto the side of an interstellar object. a system no natural comet had any reason to possess. And yet, there it was. A laser-thin highway of matter slicing through the void, carrying a message humans weren't meant to translate. Not yet. Not until someone asked the only question that mattered. If 3i Atlas is drawing a line, who, or what, is supposed to find the other end? The first clue that something was fundamentally wrong with the jet came from a detail so small, most analysts missed it on their first pass. When the object rotated, the thin beam didn't trail, lag, or distort the way a natural outgassing jet should. It held its line. A razor-thin filament of matter pinned to a single point on the nucleus, as if the comet carried its own gyroscopic correction to keep the beam perfectly aligned. That isn't what nature does. That's what a system does. NASA's photometry read the jet as deceptively weak, barely a fraction of the output expected from a comet this volatile. But when researchers applied a polarization filter, the truth emerged. The jet wasn't faint. It was too ordered. Every particle inside it moved along a single vector, aligning into a filament so narrow a human hair would look wide in comparison. This wasn't gas venting. This was collimation. Intentional or not, something inside 3i Atlas was shaping the outflow into a beam, almost like a pointer. And then the images sharpened. What looked like a simple gas release suddenly revealed microfilamentary strands weaving through the jet's core. Tiny spirals, repeating curls, not turbulence but structure, like braided plasma threads. The pattern repeated every 14 milliseconds, forming a pulse that matched the internal heat cycle logged 3 days earlier. That was the moment the senior imaging tech reportedly pushed back from his console and whispered, "This thing isn't venting, it's signaling." But the strangest part wasn't the structure of the jet, it was its direction. With each rotation, the nucleus itself drifted slightly to compensate, keeping the filament aimed at the same point in space, just a few degrees off Earth's orbital path, not toward a star, not toward a planet, not toward any meaningful gravitational body. It was pointing toward nothing. Or at least, nothing that we can see. The speculation that followed was immediate and brutal. Some argued the jet was simply tracing a fault line in the nucleus. Unlikely, but not impossible. Others insisted the beam could be an illusion caused by rotational interference. But when ESA's secondary cameras confirmed the same alignment using a completely different angle of observation, the argument died. The jet was deliberate, the jet was fixed, and whatever was producing it was tracking something. By dawn the next day, the beam thickened, not outward, not brighter, but denser. Sensors recorded a drop in dust content from the rest of the coma, as though the materials normally scattered in every direction were being siphoned inward toward the jet channel. The comet's chaotic halo was starving, pulled into a single path that refused to widen. That is not a cometary behavior. That is a system-optimizing flow. Then came the acceleration. For exactly 4.1 seconds, the jet brightened. Not gradually, instantly. A spike so clean it looked like a digital command, not a thermal spike. The vector tightened, narrowing by nearly 12%, and the beam's flight path shifted by a fraction of a degree. Just enough to lock perfectly onto whatever invisible coordinate it had been chasing. Every scientist watching felt the same cold realization. Something inside 3i Atlas had just corrected its aim. A natural object can't do that. A fractured ice body travelling at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour has no mechanism to adjust the direction of a jet with millisecond precision. And yet, there it was, silent, accurate, calibrated. NASA's upper band magnetometers detected a faint oscillation just before the correction, an ordered tremor in the magnetic sleeve around the comet, too weak to register as a field, but clean enough to map. When analysts traced the wave backward, its point of origin aligned perfectly with the jet's base, deep inside the nucleus. Something had pulsed, something had triggered, something had fired, and the jet responded. The realization hit only after the data was synced. The core of the object had anticipated rotation before the surface completed its movement. The correction wasn't reacting to drift, it was preempting it. Prediction, not response. The jet knew where the comet was going before it went there. That's the moment the messaging at NASA turned from scientific to cautious. Internal reports stopped using the word jet. They changed the classification to something else entirely. directed filament output, because this wasn't gas, this wasn't dust, this wasn't random, this was an emitter. And then, as the object passed into the heliocentric bright zone, another detail emerged, one the analysts almost missed. The beam wasn't only pointing at an invisible coordinate, it was pointing at a moving one. Something out there was shifting, slowly drifting across the background stars, something faint, too faint to detect directly. But the jet wasn't looking at the stars. It was looking at a path, a trajectory, a ghost line in the void. And with every rotation, 3i Atlas kept adjusting, following that unseen line with a precision that shouldn't exist inside anything labelled comet. The object wasn't travelling blind, it was tracking, guided, aligned. Something had told it where to aim, and now it was making sure it stayed on target. The thin jet sharpened again, not widening, not blooming, not behaving like any sublimation plume a comet should produce. It narrowed, like a blade being honed, until the beam became so precise that even NASA's high-frame sensors struggled to track its edges. And then, for the first time, the jet vibrated. It wasn't a shake, or turbulence, or thermal instability. It was a micro-oscillation, rhythmic, timed, deliberate. The kind of oscillation you'd expect from an engineered nozzle testing its output range. Every frame of the new imagery told the same story. This wasn't a plume leaking pressure. It was a controlled emission. The beam held a stable diameter of only 14 meters, and impossibly narrow, threads stretching thousands of kilometers into the void like a cosmic laser pointer. And what haunted analysts most wasn't the beam itself, but what it avoided. Space around it shifted. Dust from the coma drifted toward the jet's path, then veered away as if pushed aside by an invisible wall. Particles never entered the stream. No matter how chaotic the surrounding debris became, the beam remained untouched, almost protected. Something inside 3i Atlas was maintaining that integrity. NASA's internal models began failing. Every simulation predicted the jet should diffuse within seconds, collapsing into chaos as heat, dust, and spin tore it apart. Instead, it became cleaner, sharper, tighter, as if the object was calibrating, as if the first releases had only been tests. It was the next observation that triggered a full-scale multi-agency alert. The jet began to curve. Not naturally, not under solar wind or rotation. It curved with intention, bending in a smooth arc that followed no gravitational logic. A perfect sweeping bow that held shape even as the object spun. Observers froze, because jets don't curve toward emptiness. They curve away from heat, away from pressure, away from instability. But this one curved toward nothing, toward a blank region of space with no planets, no stars, no dust, a location, a target. The object wasn't ejecting material randomly, it was pointing. The beam's oscillation pattern intensified, forming a repeating cycle of short bursts and long pulses, like dashes and dots, but not Morse, not binary, something older, more complex, built on harmonics rather than symbols. NASA ran a cross-reference against every known natural oscillatory pattern. Solar flares, pulsars, volcanic plumes, magnetar harmonics. Nothing matched. But something almost did. Deep space communication tones from long-range transmitter arrays used by orbital probes. Not the form, not the encoding, the behavior. Each pulse carried a signature of energy conservation, a minimization of dispersion, the exact pattern seen in engineered signal systems trying to preserve clarity across enormous distances. This wasn't noise. This wasn't a random flare. It was a directed emission, behaving like communication. But communicating with what? No one had an answer, until the jet moved again. It didn't flicker. It didn't collapse. It shifted its origin. That had never been seen before. The base of the beam migrated across the surface of 3i Atlas, sliding along the nucleus like a spotlight searching a stage. Slow, deliberate, precise. The beam tracked across fractures, ridges, and reflective nodes, almost scanning them, before locking into a new position. The jet narrowed further. Its brightness dropped. Its oscillations changed. It wasn't powering down. It was adjusting, focusing, tightening the frequency, as if tuning itself toward an exact resonance. NASA's deep field. Hooray caught something that shouldn't have been possible. The beam wasn't merely light and vapour, it carried structure. Faint lattice-like formations flickered within the stream, geometry forming and dissolving too quickly to be natural. It looked like scaffolding, energy scaffolding, an invisible framework shaping the jet's interior, guiding particles through specific paths, a beam with internal architecture. That was the moment several senior physicists stopped calling it a jet. They started calling it a vector conduit. No one used that phrase publicly, but behind closed doors it became the only term that made sense. The beam no longer looked like outgassing, it looked like transmission, and then the jet changed colour. The shift was subtle at first, tiny flecks of violet sparking along the beam's edge. Then the entire emission washed into a faint purple-white hue, like ionized xenon in a propulsion chamber. This wasn't a chemical difference. This was an energy shift. Spectral analysis confirmed it. The wavelength had jumped, forming a narrow-band emission that should not exist in a natural plume. Then came the strangest part, the one that silenced the room of veteran analysts who had seen everything. The beam cast a shadow, not on the object, not on its debris, in space. A faint, elongated distortion appeared behind the jet, bending starlight ever so slightly, a gravitational ripple, a warp in local curvature. The jet wasn't just emitting, it was exerting force on space. Gravity does not move for gas, but it moves for field manipulation. By now, the object's behaviour had crossed the threshold from unprecedented to impossible. The beam intensified again, this time producing a narrow, needle-sharp flash directed outward. And something answered. Not visibly, not physically, but with a faint return resonance. A soft echo recorded across multiple instruments, like a whisper coming back through the void. Not natural reflection, not solar interference. A return signal, a handshake. The jet dimmed to a narrow ripple, then steadied. Whatever 3i Atlas had pointed at, it acknowledged. The emission ceased all erratic behaviour. It fell into perfect, balanced repetition, as if the object had finally locked into alignment with whatever it was contacting. NASA didn't release that final frame, they released the blurred version. The public saw a jet. The private team saw something else. A straight, needle-thin lance aimed at a starless region of black, and a faint pulse coming back from the dark, synchronized with the beam. That's when the whispered phrase circulated through the control rooms. It's not signaling us. It's signaling something else. And whatever it's signaling is responding back. The strangest discovery wasn't that the jet was thin, or directional, or unnervingly stable. It was that the jet shifted, not in brightness, but in purpose. When NASA overlaid the last 3 hours of imaging data, a new pattern emerged, one subtle enough to miss in isolation, but impossible to ignore when stitched into a sequence. The jet wasn't just pointing outward into empty space, it was tracking. Every time 3i Atlas rotated, the jet skimmed across a precise arc of space, just a few degrees above the ecliptic plane, not randomly sweeping, not following the spin, not drifting like exhaust. It was tracing a line, a perfectly measured path across the starfield, and that line intersected a region with no planets, no asteroids, no known bodies. But as the data team zoomed deeper into the star catalogue, one detail snapped into focus. The jet's path crossed a coordinate once used by Voyager 1 during a communication drift in 2012. That was the first moment the room went silent, because if the jet wasn't shaped by heat, and wasn't responding to sunlight, and wasn't aligning with solar wind, then it was aligning with something else entirely. On the playback feed, the jet narrowed even further, so thin it almost disappeared, like a needle of pure white light piercing the dark. It didn't widen, it didn't pulse, it didn't break apart. It held, stable, focused, unnaturally calm. Comets don't do this. Not even engineered spacecraft do this. A jet this fine should be unstable, shredding itself into turbulence after a few seconds. Yet 3i Atlas held it for nearly 6 minutes, long enough for the imaging teams to map every micron-wide fluctuation along its length. And the fluctuations weren't random either. They formed a pulse, a wave, a repeating pattern moving down the beam like a whisper riding a laser. What kind of object whispers down a jet? The finer the jet grew, the clearer its geometry became. At full magnification, The beam wasn't a column of gas at all, it was threaded. Multiple strands of ionized particles woven together in a braid so tight that no known natural process could create it. A braid is structure, a braid is choice, and whatever was choosing wasn't following the laws of comet physics. The beam tilted slightly, just a fraction of 1 degree. Then, for the first time, it locked onto a fixed position in space. NASA recalculated the orientation 3 times before they accepted the result. The jet wasn't pointing into the void. It was pointing at something moving, something faint, something cold, something drifting at the edge of detectability. And then the room felt it. A tension, an electricity, the unmistakable sense that 3I Atlas wasn't releasing a jet. It was signalling. The beam flickered once, a long pulse, bright enough that even instruments on the dark side of Earth caught the reflection. It wasn't flare behavior, it wasn't pressure recoil, it was timed. 7 seconds. Pause. 7 seconds. Pause. The exact rhythmic pattern associated with directed transmissions in deep space communication protocols. Old SETI researchers used a term for this, a mathematical knock, a way to say, I am here, I am aware, respond if you can. The imaging spectrograph detected a surge, tiny but precise, moving up the jet from the nucleus outward, like a command travelling through a guidance rail. Then something even stranger happened. The jet bent. Not much, just a slight curve, but it bent exactly the way a laser bends when passing near a gravitational field, except there was no field there, unless something invisible was sitting in its path, or something faint was returning pressure, or something out there was listening. A cold realization hit the team. The jet wasn't simply directed at space, it was directed toward a target, and that target was responding. When the data overlays came back, spectral, thermal, magnetometric, they revealed a faint echo, a reflected pulse, not strong enough to be natural, not strong enough to be noise, a shaped mirror of the jet's own signature. It was the first detected return from whatever 3I Atlas had been pointing at. In that moment, everything changed. The comet wasn't emitting a jet. It was conducting a conversation. As the jet curved and restabilized, the braid of ionized particles tightened again, as if the object were adjusting its clarity. Researchers watched in stunned silence as the beam thinned beyond previous limits, approaching single particle width, a precision impossible even for engineered satellites. The braid pattern altered. 2 strands, pause, 3 strands, pause, 1 strand, a sequence seen in pulsar data, in encoded transmissions, in intentional signals. NASA didn't say the word. No one dared. But everyone in the room thought it. This is not a comet. This is not chance. This is a device speaking in physics. The beam dimmed abruptly, then surged with renewed brightness, sharper than before, locking into a far more aggressive angle. This time, it wasn't pointing toward a drifting anomaly. It was pointing toward us. The Earth line intersected the jet's orientation within 0.04 degree. For the first time since its discovery, the jet aimed directly at our planet. Not to strike, not to heat, but to scan. Every satellite in near-Earth space felt the rise in charged particle density. A directed beam crossing Earth's orbital path wasn't subtle, it wasn't passive, it wasn't observational, it was intentional. And as the final sequence of pulses rippled down the jet, the braid of light split into 3 channels, each carrying a different modulation pattern. 3 strands, 3 signals, 3 messages. Then it stopped. Not a fade, not a decay, not a natural taper, a switch. On, off, like a machine concluding its transmission. 3I Atlas returned to silence, its thin jet collapsing back into the standard diffuse coma, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But the data recorders knew better. The cameras knew better. Every thermal, magnetic and spectroscopic sensor knew better. This wasn't a flare. This wasn't physics. This wasn't coincidence. It was action, directed, measured, purposeful. And with that purpose came the realization no one in the science division wanted to say aloud. 3I Atlas is not just being observed, it is observing back. And whatever it contacted out there, whatever returned that faint echo in the dark, is no longer silent. The second the thin jet came into clear view, every assumption collapsed. because natural jets don't do what this one did next. As the probe continued its rotation, solar illumination swept across the jet's edge like a spotlight, and the beam shifted. Not explosively, not chaotically, but in a smooth, deliberate arc only a few degrees wide. The entire plume bent gracefully, intelligently, as if it were tracking something. Observers froze. Comet jets blast straight out of fractures. They vent like geysers, they sputter, they collapse. But this jet adjusted. NASA's raw footage showed the narrow plume rotating a fraction of a degree to the left, then pausing, then sliding back into its original axis with a precision worthy of mechanical articulation. And at the very moment the jet recentered, a faint flicker rippled down its length. A wave, a pulse, almost like a signal acknowledgement. One analyst whispered the words no one wanted recorded in an official transcript: "Jets don't track things." Because that's exactly what the footage showed. The jet wasn't reacting to solar heat, or cracks, or pressure pockets. It was behaving like a directional tool, as if 3i Atlas was using it. The thin plume extended further as the probe drifted into the shadowed zone behind the object. Infrared picked up the structure the naked eye couldn't: a spine. A rigid, thread-like channel running deep under the surface, not curved, not branching, but straight. A conduit. And that conduit extended far deeper than any natural fracture ever could, straight to the core. The new data forced the engineers to combine thermal, infrared, ion backscatter, and high-res telemetry into a single composite model, hoping to visualize what no one dared to claim publicly. The model loaded, and the room went silent. The spine wasn't a crack, wasn't erosion, wasn't a tube carved by boiling ice or vapor pressure. It was uniform, straight-walled, symmetrical, a structural feed line, and inside it, the jet's pulse wasn't random turbulence. It was travelling in tight periodic waves, a heartbeat travelling through a pipe. For the first time, analysts questioned the thing they were looking at. Not the jet, not the spine, but the objects surrounding it. Because if the jet was being guided, if it was moving with purpose, then the thing firing it wasn't reacting, it was operating. When the probe repositioned for its second sweep, something even stranger appeared, a faint halo of particles forming a tight spiral around the jet, not dispersing, not drifting, orbiting it. A corkscrew of dust and charged ions wound themselves around the plume like rings around a filament. Nature doesn't build this. Jets don't produce magnetic confinement spirals, not in comets, not in asteroids, not anywhere. But the spiral held, stable, narrow, locked into place, coiling around the jet as though it were threading its path through an electromagnetic guide. And then the chilling part. The spiral began tightening, as if the core was pulling it inward, drawing it, feeding on it. No one breathed as the readings updated, because the tightening wasn't random. It matched the timing from the earlier pulse. At that moment, engineers realized the jet wasn't expelling material, it was manipulating it, gathering, redirecting, recycling, a mechanism masquerading as a plume. The team ran a comparative analysis against every known natural jet profile: cometary, volcanic, cryovolcanic, tidal activated, and none matched. Before they could debate further, the probe caught a flash. A tiny burst of coherent light inside the jet stream, less than a millisecond long. Not a reflection, not noise, a directed microflare. When magnified, the flare showed sharp spectral lines, not smeared like natural plasma, clean, exact, timed. A single, perfect burst of energy threaded down the jet spine, and at the exact microsecond that burst exited the plume, the spiral around it tightened again. The jet wasn't just moving matter, it was transmitting, a directed jet with embedded pulses, wrapped in a confining spiral, fired through a rigid internal conduit. Nothing about this was comet-like, nothing about it was passive. The next moment sealed it. As the probe drifted further, its instruments detected a faint radio disturbance. Not interference, not scatter, but patterned deviation in its carrier signal. The jet was emitting on band, not loud enough to be a broadcast, not strong enough to overpower telemetry, just a subtle distortion, a whisper in the noise floor, a modulation so small only a mission-grade receiver could catch it. The engineers filtered the signal. The deviation repeated every 2.13 seconds. Then again. 3 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, pause. A repeating pattern, a rhythm, a code. And right as the analysts began writing algorithms to decode it, the jet narrowed further, almost as if it sensed it was being observed, and the pulses stopped. Not gradually, instantly. The beam collapsed into a razor line barely wider than a pencil. Then, without warning, the entire jet flipped direction by 0.4 degrees. Not because of heat, not because of rotation, because of choice. It pointed to something. The probe's logs confirmed it. The jet was now angled perfectly toward a distant region of empty space, a single coordinate, a fixed bearing. A line drawn through the void. The analysts cross-referenced the heading. Their faces dropped. The direction the jet pointed to was not random. It wasn't toward the Sun, or Jupiter, or the galactic plane. It pointed toward a region almost no one would think to check, a patch of space nearly devoid of stars, radio signals, or dust, a cold, empty void. But 11 years ago, something important passed through that exact region, something built by humans, something still transmitting. Voyager. 1. The same machine that vanished into a radio blackout the moment 3I Atlas first entered the heliopause in 2012. And now, years later, the jet inside 3I Atlas, a jet that behaves like an engineered beam, a jet that carries pulses, a jet that locks into alignments, is pointing right at the last known coordinates of humanity's most distant probe. Every analyst looking at the data reached the same unspoken conclusion. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't physics. It wasn't natural. It was intentional. A thin, directed jet, trained on the path of Voyager 1. And whatever 3I Atlas was doing, it wasn't hiding it anymore. It was answering something, or calling back, or aiming, or waiting. The probe recorded one more faint pulse, almost below detection threshold. One last whisper. Then the jet winked out, as if the conversation, whatever it was, had ended. Something shifted inside 3I Atlas before anyone realized what they were seeing. The jet, once dismissed as a faint filament of gas, narrowed again, not randomly, not mechanically, with intention. Its once soft edges sharpened into a perfectly defined line that extended thousands of kilometers into open space without dispersing, without degrading, and without flickering in the solar wind. Every model broke simultaneously. A natural jet should have exploded outward, ballooned with pressure, scattered into dust and plasma as the object tumbled. But this jet, it acted like a beam, a single, unwavering stroke of motion, more reminiscent of a laser than a plume. And with each passing hour, the geometry around it tightened, concentrating into a structure so impossibly thin that researchers began referring to it, quietly, nervously, as the filament. But the shock didn't come from the jet itself. It came from what happened to the space around it. Distance near the filament began to distort. Not visibly, but measurably. Background stars behind the jet shifted by a fraction of an arc-second. Not enough for the public to notice, but enough for gravitational analysts to panic. Space was bending. Photons changed trajectory as they approached the jet's alignment. It was the smallest, cleanest gravitational anomaly ever recorded for any object smaller than a moon. And that made no sense. A tiny jet shouldn't affect gravity at all, unless it wasn't a jet, unless it wasn't ejecting matter, unless it was pulling something. As the distortion thickened, the jet began to flicker, not randomly but in a staccato pulse pattern. 3 flashes, pause, 2 flashes, longer pause, then 1. A sequence. The filament wasn't venting, it was signaling, and that meant someone, something, had built a mechanism inside the object capable of modulating matter flow at microsecond precision. Something that understood external observation, something that wanted to be seen. NASA, ESA, and JAXA all locked their radio dishes into the jet's line of travel. The signal wasn't radio, it wasn't infrared, it wasn't magnetic. It was a kind of microdensity compression, an oscillation in the medium of space itself, too weak to tear anything apart, too strong to be a natural byproduct of outgassing. It was engineered. As the pulse repeated, the filament grew brighter, as though internal pressure were being rerouted into the jet's spine. Neutrino detectors, normally silent, began clicking like rainfall. Something below the surface had awakened. No one said it. Everyone felt it. The jet was not releasing energy. It was channeling it. The object's rotation synchronized. The coma tightened. The tail straightened. Everything about 3i Atlas began to orbit around the jet, aligning to its direction like planets around a star. And then, finally, the impossible happened. The jet shifted its aim, not gradually, not passively, but with the decisive precision of a system making a choice. In a single smooth motion, the filament pivoted away from the distant void and swung toward a position no one ever expected it to target. Earth. The angle wasn't hostile, it wasn't a weapon's trajectory, it was alignment, pure, mathematically perfect alignment, toward our planet's orbital position 17 hours in the future. A future point, a calculated point. The filament pulsed again, brighter, faster, more urgent. 3 flashes, pause, 2 flashes, pause, 1, a countdown. Astronomers scrambled, defense networks went silent. Every space agency on Earth watched the thin directed jet lock onto the invisible path Earth would cross, like a compass needle snapping to its true north. The reaction wasn't chaos, it was dread. Because as the filament stabilized, something else emerged. A faint, ghost-like ring formed around its base. An almost invisible halo that distorted starlight even more clearly. It wasn't a natural halo. It wasn't gas. It was absence. An outline of space where energy vanished into something unseen. A conduit. A receiver. A weapon. No. Something more unsettling. A mechanism waiting for confirmation. The pulse sequence suddenly accelerated. The flicker sped to a rapid heartbeat, then steadied into a single continuous glow. The filament elongated, sharpened even further, and then it changed colour. A soft tonal shift in the visible spectrum from blue-white to a narrow gold band as if tuning itself. Spectral analysts noticed the change instantly. That wavelength corresponded with one thing: measurement. The jet was scanning Earth's orbital corridor, not measuring dust, not calculating trajectory, scanning. The filament swept across the predicted path Earth would occupy. It stretched like a ruler across cosmic emptiness. A gauge, a tool, something measuring a fixed distance between 2 coordinated points, not between Earth and 3i Atlas, between the jet and something else, something not yet detected, something the jet expected to be there. NASA ran deep sky sweeps. Nothing. No object, no mass, no energy source, just the silent abyss. But the jet kept measuring anyway, as if double-checking a position only it knew, as if confirming the arrival of something that had been expected long before humans watched the sky. The tension in mission control was indescribable. Not fear, not confusion. Something worse. Recognition. Every anomaly from the past year, the nested shells, the thermal pulses, the axis triangulation, the reflective core wall, the mass damping layer, the photonic waveguides, every piece had been building toward a single purpose: stability, alignment, calibration, so that the jet, this impossibly thin, impossibly precise filament, could be pointed exactly where it needed to be. And now it was. Earth wasn't the target. Earth was the reference point. Something else was coming. Something the jet needed to guide, measure, or signal. And the worst part, the filament wasn't brightening anymore. It was thinning, sharpening into something beyond visible measurement. A needle of aligned particles, a line drawn across the void, a doorway waiting to be completed. As the final adjustments locked in, 3i Atlas, quiet, cold, deceptive, did something that none of the agencies expected. Its rotation stopped, completely. The entire object held still in space, suspended like a satellite in a moment of absolute clarity. Then, for the first time ever, the filament didn't flicker. It whispered. A tremor through the solar wind, a vibration in the magnetic field, a pulse in deep space telemetry. One message, one impossible signature, Not random, not natural, not human. Something has noticed us. And now, something is answering. The new jet didn't behave like a plume, or a vent, or anything the Deep Space Network had prepared for. By the time NASA confirmed its presence, the jet had already begun doing something no natural emission should ever do. It was correcting itself. As the thin beam extended outward, it didn't scatter, wobble, or widen. It compensated. Every external disturbance, solar wind pressure, micro-debris impacts, even magnetic turbulence, caused the jet to shift by microscopic angles, each adjustment so fast it looked instantaneous. A plume should drift. A plume should bend. A plume should break apart. This one didn't. It acted like it wanted to stay perfectly straight. The beam sharpened until it resembled a line drawn with a ruler across the void of space. Engineers joked that if you scale the jet up to a laser pointer, it could trace a perfect dot on a planet millions of miles away. Except, this wasn't a joke. At its current coherence, it could. And that begged one question. Why would a comet need a jet this precise? Inside mission control, the silence was suffocating. Every monitor showed the same anomaly, each from a different instrument, each confirming the same impossible truth. The jet wasn't venting energy, it was channeling it, moving it, shaping it. Then something happened that turned unease into dread. As the jet held its impossibly narrow line, the object's rotation slowed, just slightly, just enough to be measurable. But the timing was perfect, as if 3i Atlas was matching its own spin to the jet's direction. And then, the jet moved, not drifted, not deflected. Moved, pivoting like a needle sweeping across a dial, a sweeping arc, smooth and controlled, tracing space like it was searching for something. The beam glided across the dark sky until it halted on a fixed point. Nothing visible, nothing bright, nothing known. A patch of sky so empty it shouldn't have held significance. But the moment the jet locked onto it, the comet's internal temperature spiked. 3 degrees, 6, 9. A perfect escalation, not chaotic, not reactive, sequenced. Whatever the jet was pointing at, it mattered. NASA's spectral overlays caught another shift, a low-frequency hum emanating from deep inside the nucleus, a hum identical to one recorded 13 years ago, the same strange oscillation detected in the aftermath of the 2012 Voyager telemetry blackout, the blackout no one ever explained. The blackout many believed was caused by cosmic interference, but the frequency match wasn't a coincidence. The hum inside 3i Atlas now matched Voyager's 2012 anomaly, down to the 4th decimal. The comet wasn't pointing at an empty coordinate. It was pointing toward Voyager's ancient path. The jet tightened even further, down to a width approaching only a few meters at millions of kilometers distance. That level of precision was absurd, terrifying. And then the second change occurred. The jet color shifted. A faint violet tint crept through the beam, flickering in pulses. 1 long, 2 short, 1 long, 3 short. A pattern. Not noise, not solar interference. A signal. Somewhere in the room, someone whispered the word out loud. Communication. The jet brightened. The pulses sharpened. Thermal maps inside the nucleus revealed a new chamber heating up, one that had never been detected in any prior scans. It heated not like a chemical reaction, but like a containment system preparing to release something controlled, something timed, and as the pulses accelerated, the comet's rotation stopped entirely. A comet should never stop spinning. It should tumble. It should wobble. It should be pushed, around by momentum, heat, radiation. But 3i Atlas held still, balanced in vacuum like a stabilized machine. The jet locked onto its target. The hum deepened. And for the first time since entering the solar system, 3i Atlas acted with unmistakable purpose. It wasn't releasing energy, it was transmitting. No one on Earth yet knew what was being sent. No one understood the message. No one could predict whether it was a call, a response, a test, or a warning. But one thing was certain now. The thin jet wasn't a plume, or a vent, or a natural emission. It was an instrument, a device, a mechanism buried inside something that should not be capable of any of this, and it had just been activated. The moment the thin jet steadied into a needle of white-blue light, every agency assumed it would behave like a normal outgassing plume, broadening, fading, losing coherence as it met the solar wind. But it didn't. Instead, it narrowed. It sharpened. It focused into a line so impossibly straight that astronomers had to check their instruments for mechanical failure. The jet didn't disperse. It held its shape like a laser confined inside a body of ice and carbon. And then it moved. Not randomly, not gradually, with purpose. The jet tilted 3 degrees, nothing to an ordinary observer, but to anyone watching the data stream it was unmistakably controlled. The angle shifted towards something. Not toward the Sun, not toward Jupiter, not toward the comet's projected orbital arc, but toward empty space, toward a point no telescope had flagged, a region with no object, no radio source, nothing catalogued. The jet pointed at a coordinate. NASA's vector analysis team mapped it immediately. When the trajectory was extrapolated backward, the result sent a chill down every spine. The directed jet aligned perfectly with the same point 3I Atlas had oriented toward during its first axis stabilization event 2 weeks earlier. A point astronomers still couldn't explain. It wasn't a coincidence. Instrument logs revealed micropulses in the jet, fine rhythmic flickers hidden inside the beam like data stitched into a thread of light. Each pulse was identical in timing to the thermal cycle, detected deep inside the nucleus weeks prior. The repetition was uncanny. A mechanical heartbeat extended into space, carried outward in a jet that should not exist. And yet the most disturbing part wasn't the jet or the pulses. It was the silence. The coma surrounding 3I Atlas dimmed. Dust output dropped. Plasma trails stabilized. The entire object quieted, as if concentrating, as if all external expression had narrowed into this single thread of coherent discharge. Within minutes, the reflected solar light around the comet decreased by 14%. Not because the object dimmed, but because the jet absorbed or redirected surrounding particles. Dust that should have been illuminated vanished into the beam's path, sucked, inward or crushed into alignment. The beam wasn't emitting chaos, it was enforcing order. Observers started calling it the spine of the comet, the spine of something more. Then came the energy spike. The jet brightened, just slightly, just enough to saturate sensors. But inside that spike was a second signature nobody anticipated. A low-frequency gravitational ripple. Faint, perfectly timed with each rise and fall of the jet. The correlation was 1-to-1. The jet wasn't just light, heat, or plasma, it was a control arm. Something deep in the nucleus was adjusting the external beam the same way a ship might adjust a thruster. Each pulse altered the gravitational microsignature as if the internal system used the jet to stabilize, to measure, or to signal. The ESA's harmonic analysis division produced a model within an hour. When compared to known thrust control patterns from artificial spacecraft, the match was uncomfortably close, too close for coincidence. Every pulse belonged to a stabilization cycle, a course correction, a calibration. The narrow jet wasn't venting, it was maneuvering. And then the light bent. A ripple passed along the jet, bending the beam inward, curving toward the comet itself before snapping back into alignment. Light shouldn't curve without passing through atmosphere, gravity wells, or heavy magnetic fields. But nothing was there. The jet altered its own geometry, folding space around itself for a fraction of a second. That was the moment the room went dead silent. Because the only systems on record that can bend their own emissions are coherent beam cavity resonators, devices that compress energy long enough to manipulate their output direction with precision. Meaning 3I Atlas was not releasing this jet, it was using it to orient, to sense, to communicate, maybe all at once. Within the jet's core, faint density irregularities formed a pattern, evenly spaced voids, lined in a helix, moving through the beam like a rotational code, a spiral of absence, a digital fingerprint wrapped inside light. As the beam pulsed, those voids tightened their rotation, faster, cleaner, more deliberate. The jet wasn't evolving, it was adjusting, responding to feedback, refining itself in real time. Something inside the comet was learning. The final moment came without warning. A deep resonant flash, almost invisible to human eyes, raced down the length of the jet. Infrared sensors saw it plainly, a massive sudden discharge travelling outward at near relativistic speed. But instead of expanding, instead of dissipating, the discharge vanished at the edge of the beam's reach. Gone. Not faded. Gone. As though a doorway had opened, only long enough for the pulse to pass through. And when the flash disappeared, the jet didn't weaken. It steadied. Its pulse rate dropped. Its flicker ceased. Its angle locked into a precision orientation so perfect it made satellites look imprecise by comparison. 3i Atlas had finished whatever it was doing. The jet's final vector was not random. It was aimed at a point 12.4 billion kilometers away, a point where a small, silent spacecraft, one launched by humans nearly 50 years ago, still drifts through the dark. Voyager 1. The thin-directed jet wasn't just pointing. It was aiming at the exact region of space where Voyager's last week's signal originated, as if 3i Atlas were calling something back, or answering something sent long ago, or preparing for a rendezvous humanity never predicted. And for the first time in the entire investigation, the question shifted from what 3i Atlas is, to who it's talking to, and why. The jet should have weakened as 3i Atlas spun. Every model said so. Every comet in the solar system obeys that rule without exception. When a nucleus rotates, its jets fracture into spirals, smear into chaotic arcs, break apart into ragged sheets of vapor. But this one didn't. The new directed jet held its shape like a laser. Sharp, linear, unwavering. A thread of white plasma slicing through the blackness with the precision of engineered machinery. And then scientists noticed something far stranger. The jet wasn't aligning with the sun. It wasn't pointing toward the heat source that should have created it. It was aiming toward a fixed point in space, a point 3i Atlas should not even know exists. 20 million kilometers behind it, the James Webb Sensor Array picked up a flicker. A faint, almost imperceptible spark of reflected light. At first it looked like debris, then the shape sharpened, a pinpoint, a shimmer, a bead of metallic reflection hanging motionless in the darkness. The jet was pointing directly at it. NASA froze the data feed. Analysts stared at the coordinates, then at each other, each waiting for someone else to say what none of them wanted to say. The object wasn't accelerating, it wasn't drifting, it wasn't moving at all. It was stationary, locked in place as though anchored by something invisible. But there was no natural mechanism that could hold an object perfectly still in the solar wind. Not at this scale, not at this distance, not with the sun's radiation screaming across empty space. Which meant one thing. The object wasn't being held. It was holding itself, and 3i Atlas was signalling to it. The jet pulsed once, a quick flick, barely measurable, then again, short, precise, timed, not outgassing, not pressure release, not sublimation, a pattern. The signal repeated 3 times, 3 identical pulses, each separated by exactly 4.77 seconds, a timing consistent with no known thermodynamic cycle. The stationary point of light responded, not visibly, not with motion, but with radio noise. The deep space network caught the echo, a faint burst of static that shouldn't exist in the vacuum, bouncing across 3 antennas, simultaneously with a delay too coordinated to be random. The timing was perfect. 4.77 seconds. A mirror. A reply. Something out there had just acknowledged 3i Atlas. Every console lit red. Automatic flags cascaded down the monitoring screens. Telemetry loops froze mid-frame. This wasn't a system error. This wasn't interference. Something in deep space had spoken back. Scientists raced to amplify the return signature. They filtered the noise, compressed the waveform, and isolated the core pulse. What emerged wasn't natural. It wasn't solar. It wasn't cosmic. It wasn't background radiation. It was geometric. A rise, a plateau, a drop, clean, intentional, encoded. A structure in the signal that mirrored the brightness modulation inside 3i Atlas's jet. The comet, or whatever it truly was, had initiated a communication link with a target that had somehow been waiting in its path. But the biggest shock wasn't the signal. It was the movement that followed. The stationary object, that tiny glint of reflective material, flickered again. Once, twice. Then it blinked out, gone, vanished, no drift, no trace, as if it had never been there at all. "Check occlusion," one scientist muttered. "Check thermal signature," another said. Nothing. Then a cold whisper passed through the data logs. The object had reappeared, this time much closer, 2 million kilometers, too fast for any known propulsion, too slow to be a glitch. It had moved deliberately into a new position, directly along the projected path of the directed jet. The jet brightened. Its edges tightened into a knife-thin beam, as though concentrating itself. The target in the distance pulsed back. A handshake, a pairing sequence, an alignment. And in that moment, a horrifying realization spread across every control room watching the event. 3i Atlas wasn't firing the jet randomly. It wasn't stabilizing. It wasn't venting. It was aiming. It was adjusting its rotation, repositioning its axis, and narrowing the jet so precisely that orbital mechanics teams confirmed what no one wanted to say out loud. The thin, directed jet was a tracking mechanism, not a flare, not a feature, not a cometary jet, a tool, an instrument, a beam that pointed toward a node, a receiver, a marker, and whatever the stationary object was, it had responded the instant 3i Atlas signaled it. "This isn't communication," one engineer whispered. "This is coordination." Because the jet, when plotted on a three-dimensional map, formed an exact line between 3i Atlas and the moving point of light. A line of contact, a tether, a link. As if the two objects weren't separate at all, but components of the same system. The data streams converged, a full-scale visualization appeared on the main screen. 2 nodes, 1 beam, a single geometric alignment bridging the void, and that's when the temperature readings changed. The directed jet wasn't just light, it wasn't just heat, it was carrying information, variations in thermal gradients that encoded something deeper than pulses. It was transferring energy in discrete packets, controlled, measured, intentional, a transfer, a transaction, from 3i Atlas to the waiting receiver. The jet dimmed momentarily and the receiver brightened. The exchange lasted only 6 seconds, but it completely changed the trajectory predictions. 3i Atlas internal temperature stabilized. Its coma density dropped. Its spin precision increased, as if the object had just completed a calibration procedure, a recalibration with help from something already inside the solar system. The world had just watched an interstellar traveler sink with a hidden companion, and the directed jet wasn't the anomaly. It was the confirmation. Something else was out there, and 3i Atlas wasn't alone. The new directed jet should have collapsed by now. Every model said so. Every simulation insisted the structure was too thin, too coherent, too stable to survive the violent physics around it. But instead of tearing apart, it sharpened. What began as a hairline filament, barely detectable, barely luminous, was now a perfectly straight needle-like stream, extending thousands of kilometers behind 3i Atlas, holding its shape with a precision no natural comet in history has ever displayed. When the image data arrived from the L2 relays, the room fell silent. It wasn't wide. It wasn't chaotic. It was a line, one impossibly narrow beam of gas and ionized particles so concentrated it looked like someone had drawn it with a razor across the dark. But the strangest part wasn't the jet itself. It was the target. The beam was angled, not trailing the object's motion, not pushed by solar wind, but deliberately offset, pointing at a fixed vector in space with a margin of error so small it might as well have been intentional. Engineers were the first to notice. It wasn't pointing at the sun, it wasn't pointing at Earth, it wasn't pointing at Jupiter, it was pointing at empty space, or at least what looked like empty space. And then the spectral analysis came in. The beam wasn't dispersing like a normal jet. It wasn't fanning out or drifting. It was maintaining coherence across unimaginable distances as if being guided by something, internally or externally. The thin jet pulsed once. A ripple of brightness shot down its length like a signal travelling a wire. 3 minutes later, it pulsed again. NASA replayed both frames side by side. The pulses weren't identical. One was slightly brighter, one was slightly longer, one carried a faint harmonic in the ultraviolet band, the same harmonic observed in earlier internal anomalies, a pattern, a sequence, a timing structure. This wasn't venting, it was transmitting. But transmitting to what? That was the question no one in the room wanted to ask, because deep scan imagery showed something else. A faint distortion at the far end of the jet, a subtle warp in background starlight that shouldn't exist at all unless something invisible was interacting with the beam. Astronomers checked for gravitational lensing. Nothing. They looked for dark dust clouds. Nothing. They analysed solar interference. Nothing. Whatever was at the end of the beam had no mass, no heat signature, no visible presence, and yet the jet bent around it, curved ever so slightly, as if grazing the boundary of an unseen structure. The directed jet had a destination, but the destination wasn't visible. The moment that realization hit the room, the telemetry lit up again. A third pulse. This one wasn't like the other two. It wasn't bright. It wasn't narrow. It was complex, layered, like multiple signals stacked inside one beam. Infrared, ultraviolet, radio-adjacent noise, each one interwoven and rising through the jet like code encoded within light. The jet wasn't just a transmission. It was a multi-channel data stream. This was the first time anyone had seen anything like it. 3 separate energy bands spiraling down a single stream of plasma, each rotating in perfect counterphase, synchronized to the millisecond. A design far beyond anything seen in natural physics. The directed jet pulsed again. The room erupted with warnings, solar wind spikes, field distortions, particle clustering. But none of those explanations held. The pulses were too structured, too rhythmic, too deliberate. Someone finally said what everyone was thinking. This looks like a handshake signal. A handshake. The way 2 systems announce their presence. The way a beacon verifies another beacon is online. A protocol. Moments later, the jet stiffened. Visibly, measurably, like a physical object holding tension. And something moved at its tip. Not light. Not matter. A ripple. A ripple in the same direction the jet was aimed. A ripple that did not come from 3i Atlas. The distortion grew clearer, sharper, more defined. It was faint but unmistakable. A line of motion synchronized with the jet's pulses, drifting like a thread pulled taut through vacuum. Then another ripple, then another. And suddenly the data made sense. There wasn't one directed jet. There were 2. The second one wasn't coming from 3i Atlas. It was coming toward it. A return signal. A reply. The thin beam wasn't just broadcasting. It was connecting to something else. Something far away. Something faint. Something hidden behind the backdrop of space itself. And that something had just answered. For the first time since entering the solar system, 3i Atlas reacted visibly, subtly altering its trajectory by a measurable fraction of a degree. Not enough to alarm, but enough to confirm one thing. It had received the reply. The jet dimmed, then narrowed even further, so thin it looked like a single thread of silver stretched across infinity. Then the 4th pulse triggered. This one wasn't structured like the others. It wasn't bright. It wasn't patterned. It wasn't a signal at all. It was a lock. The thin jet froze. No oscillation, no drift, no distortion, as the return jet fused to its tip like 2 threads connecting in mid-space. For a fraction of a second, the 2 beams formed a line so straight and so impossibly stable that the background stars behind it distorted as one unified field. 2 points in space were now connected by a filament thinner than a human hair, held together by forces no comet should be capable of manipulating. But the real shock wasn't the connection. It was what happened next. A tiny, unexplainable drop in local spacetime curvature, a gravitational dip so subtle that instruments almost missed it. Not caused by mass, not caused by motion, caused by data transfer. The jet wasn't a beam. It was a channel, a conduit, a bridge. And something structured, something coherent, something intelligent was passing through it. The images flickered. The field readings spiked. The distortion at the jet's far end widened. NASA didn't know what it was. They only knew one terrifying truth. 3i Atlas wasn't sending a message into the void. It was talking to something already there. The jet wasn't drifting anymore. It was aiming, not broadly, not across a wide arc like natural comet vents, but along a razor-thin, unwavering line that cut through the darkness like a pointer guided by intention. For nearly an hour, every observatory that locked onto 3I Atlas reported the same anomaly. The jet tightened, sharpened, and narrowed into a filament so precise it behaved less like outgassing and more like targeting. But the most unsettling part wasn't what the jet did. It was what it didn't do. It didn't diffuse. It didn't scatter. It didn't change shape with rotation. Even when the nucleus shifted, the jet compensated instantly, maintaining a perfect vector orientation, as if something inside the core was correcting for the movement in real time. That was the moment the tone inside Mission Control changed. From curiosity to the quiet, suffocating tension of people realizing something is happening that cannot be explained with the physics they know. Because jets don't track. Jets don't hold angles. Jets don't lock onto fixed geometry across dozens of rotations, unless the jet isn't a jet, unless it's a beamline. Infrared telescopes picked up microvariations across its length, hot, cold, hot again, patterned in a repeating band structure. Natural emissions fade, they blur, they break apart. This one pulsed in steps, each one separated by fractions of a second, like ticks from the internal clock of a mechanism too old to guess and too advanced to model. One scientist said it quietly, almost under her breath, but the microphone caught it anyway. That's a transmission, not a plume. No one disagreed. The next anomaly came from the part of the sky the jet was pointing toward. A patch of darkness, empty, silent, nothing special, until a faint ripple of polarized light flickered across it. A shimmer, a distortion. Not strong enough to be an object, but too structured to be noise. 3 agencies ran independent comparisons. The conclusion was identical. The jet wasn't just pointing at a location, it was interacting with it. Minutes later, the shimmer deepened. A second ripple followed, and then a third, slower, heavier, more deliberate, moving in the exact same rhythm as the jet's micropulses. Cause and reply. Like a whisper returned in the dark. The data analysts panicked first. The physicists followed. By the time the signal processing teams confirmed the reflection patterns, the room had already gone silent. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a visual trick. This wasn't an artifact. This was a response signature. But the real shock came when they traced the direction of the jet backward through the object's spin. The vector didn't intersect a random region of space. It aligned with a trajectory 3I Atlas had passed through years earlier, long before it entered the inner solar system, a place no probe has reached, no telescope has mapped, no mission has explored, a place behind the ecliptic, behind the galactic dust sheets, a place where light rarely escapes, the dark behind the dark. Whatever the jet was communicating with, it was behind us, and whatever was responding was already listening. The reflection signal grew stronger with each pulse, not bright, not loud, but more coherent, like a weak radio tuning itself to match a broadcast. Spectral deconvolution revealed harmonic peaks at regular intervals, spaced with a precision that could not be natural. Each peak followed a logarithmic curve, each curve aligned perfectly with the thermal timing observed in previous 3I Atlas anomalies. 3 pulses, pause, 2 pulses, long pause. The same internal rhythm the nucleus follows. It wasn't trying to hide it anymore. The jet thickened, not by widening, but by intensifying, its core brightening until the surrounding coma dimmed in comparison. Sensors captured microscopic changes in the jet's internal density, a spiraling twist, a modulation pattern, like a message being encoded along the length of a filament. Not a beam, not a plume, a carrier. Then came the point of no return. The reflected signal, once faint, shaky, inconsistent, suddenly locked in place. A perfect mirror pulse, angle matched, frequency matched, timing matched, the first fully synchronized echo from whatever lay in that direction. A handshake. Humanity has been listening for signals for decades. No one expected the first handshake to come. Through a comet, or whatever this thing is now, speaking in pulses, beams, and the careful modulation of a directed jet, aimed into a stretch of darkness we do not understand. Then the core of 3I Atlas changed. Infrared sensors saw the temperature dip at the base of the jet. Optical arrays caught a faint glow spreading across the nucleus, not outward, but inward, like light collapsing into the object rather than escaping it. The jet narrowed further, the echo strengthened, and then the vector shifted just 0.02 degrees, as if the whole system, the comet, the core, the beam, and the unseen partner, had corrected the alignment between them at the same moment. 3 systems acting in synchrony across millions of kilometers. No one believed the data at first. They recalibrated instruments, restarted servers, cross-referenced with backups. Nothing changed. The anomaly held. The jet was now in active lock with something external. It was no longer broadcasting, it was exchanging. And then, in the final frames before the object rotated out of view, the jet flickered at its base, not in random pulses, but in characters, sharp, block-like, structured shadows inside the plasma, a pattern, a script, a language. The last telemetry packet captured it for exactly 0.13 seconds before the rotation arc cut the structure out of view and the jet reverted to its previous state. Scientists froze the frame, zoomed, enhanced, cried, argued, fought, went silent. Because the shape wasn't random. It wasn't geological. It wasn't fluid. It was a repeating unit, a glyph, burned into plasma, timed to the pulse, aligned to the vector, projected by a jet that acts like a signal and responds like a listening device. No one said the word in the room, but everyone thought it. Intent. Because nature doesn't send glyphs, and comets don't aim jets, and nothing drifting in interstellar space should be able to talk back. But 3i Atlas just did, and the universe just replied. The jet should have curled, scattered, or dispersed into a chaotic plume. Every model said so. But instead it knifed through the darkness with the precision of a drawn line, a thread of incandescent blue carving across the coma, as if the vacuum itself had parted to make room for it. And as the imaging arrays sharpened their resolution, the impossible truth emerged. This wasn't a natural emission. It wasn't expanding. It wasn't diffusing. It was staying tight, as though bound by an unseen corridor, guided, confined, and locked to a single direction with unforgiving discipline. Even stranger, the jet didn't radiate outward evenly. It didn't obey the thermal gradients or the pressures expected from a tumbling interstellar body. No, this jet tracked with the spin, then diverged, bending off axis as if responding to a rule only it understood. When the object rotated, the jet did not follow the rotation like a plume would. It held its vector. A straight, unwavering line, pointing somewhere. NASA analysts didn't say the word aimed, but everyone in the room thought it. The latest deep field pass from the Sentinel orbiter captured a phenomenon no one had anticipated. The jet had structure inside it. A luminous core wrapped in a dimmer sheath, like a fiber optic cable glowing from within. The inner beam flickered with rhythmic nodes, bright, dim, bright, spaced evenly across its entire length. When the flux analysts plotted the cadence, the pattern resolved into something terrifyingly familiar, a repeating harmonic, not noise, not turbulence, a signal signature. The room went dead quiet, because nature can pulse, it can oscillate, it can stutter in heat and pressure. But nature does not form harmonic nodes inside a high-velocity directed jet. As the object moved closer to the inner solar system, the jet's behavior sharpened even further. It tuned itself, compressed, refined its edges as if narrowing its own tolerance for error. At one point, it even tightened by a full 0.3 degrees, far too precise to be governed by sublimating ice. That kind of correction implied a feedback mechanism, a control system. What was controlling it? More importantly, what was it pointing at? The revelation hit during a combined pass from 3 arrays, one in Hawaii, one in the Canary Islands, and one on a lunar relay satellite. When their images were stacked, aligned, and motion corrected, the jet didn't just appear directed. It appeared anchored, perfectly aligned to a point far beyond Earth. Not a star, not a planet, a moving object, one trailing behind 3i Atlas on a similar inbound trajectory, something following it. Some analysts whispered the unthinkable. Is it communicating with something behind it? Others took it further. Is it marking a path? But then the thermal readings deepened the mystery even more. The base of the jet, where it emerged from the nucleus, remained cold. Colder than the surrounding ice. Colder than the predicted model. Almost exactly at CMB temperature. Just like the structured core detected months ago. That implied a mechanism, not an eruption, a vent that didn't heat as it ejected matter, a vent designed for efficiency, and that vent pulsed every time the inner harmonic brightened. A jet like this wasn't supposed to exist. Not in physics, not in astronomy, not in any comet science ever written. But this wasn't a comet. Not anymore. The next anomaly came from the jet's shadow. As it passed in front of background starlight, something unreal happened. The stars didn't simply dim, they bent. Refraction occurred along the jet's edges, forming a clear boundary sheath, like the jet was wrapped in a thin film of altered space. It wasn't plasma containment, it wasn't magnetic confinement, it was something else, something with gravitational influence. The sheath distorted light the same way the object's internal energy lattice had months earlier. The jet wasn't just light or matter, it was contained energy, coherent, stable, directed. And then came the moment no one knew how to interpret. The jet flickered, once, twice, 8 times in rapid succession, each pulse separated by the exact harmonic that had been detected before. But during this flicker, the jet rotated, not with the comet's spin, but independently, pulling its line across empty space like a scanning beam. It swept a 17-degree arc, stopped, and then returned to its original vector with machine-like accuracy. This was not a geological event. This was not sublimation. This was not physics as we know it. This was a search pattern, a directed scan from an interstellar object that should have been nothing more than rock and ice. The jet dimmed, only for a moment, then brightened again with a brilliance that saturated the upper sensors of the lunar array. The beam locked back onto the same point behind the comet, like a lighthouse beam signalling a ship waiting in the fog. By the time the final frames came in, one truth had become unavoidable. 3i Atlas was no longer just moving. It was doing something, and whatever this thin, impossibly directed jet was, it wasn't an accident, it wasn't natural, it wasn't random, it was intentional. The jet didn't behave like a plume anymore, it behaved like a pointer. As the object drifted past heliocentric longitude 14D, the beam locked into a straight-line orientation and refused to deviate even as solar wind pressure increased. It didn't bend, it didn't arc. It cut through the streaming particles like a fibre-thin blade of coherent light. Every scientist expected turbulence, diffraction, scattering, something that would make the jet behave like normal comet exhaust. But this was different. The thin, directed jet held its structure with an almost surgical rigidity, maintaining a fixed angle against forces that should have shredded its integrity within seconds. No natural volatile outgassing can hold a straight-line pattern under those conditions. And yet, 3i Atlas did. Quiet, unwavering, as if the jet wasn't reacting to the sun but ignoring it altogether. For the first time, the theory that had been whispered privately, then buried, now forced itself back into the open. Something inside the nucleus was controlling the jet, not releasing pressure, not venting trapped volatiles, aiming. The moment that realization took hold, telescopes across the network switched into high-speed capture. What they found deepened the mystery. At the exact moment the jet aligned into its razor-straight configuration, the dust cloud around the nucleus thinned, pulling inward as if being sucked toward the inner chamber. This meant the jet wasn't losing mass, it was concentrating it. And then, as if responding to some unseen instruction, the beam narrowed further until it reached a width no thicker than the antenna of a spacecraft. That level of collimation is unheard of in cometary physics. Thermal venting spreads, it does not focus. So why was this one sharpening? The directed jet flickered, just once. A blink so faint that only one high frame rate camera caught it, and only by accident. But that single flicker exposed the truth that nobody wanted to say out loud. The jet had pulse structure, not random bursts, not chaotic flickers, pulses, timed, layered, patterned. Whatever was inside 3i Atlas was not just venting energy, it was shaping it. And then the jet changed colour. For 68 seconds, the razor-thin beam shifted into a deep blue, the wavelength dropping into a band that suggested ionization, magnetically induced rather than thermally driven. The only natural objects known to produce jets in that spectrum were neutron stars. collapsed stellar remnants with magnetic fields strong enough to twist space. 3i Atlas was the size of a mountain, so where was this power coming from? The beam darkened again, fading into a silver thread, then stabilizing into a pure white line that extended millions of kilometers behind the object. When the light passed near a cluster of solar wind particles, it didn't scatter, it steered them. Particles slid out of the beam path, curling around it like the jet was wrapped in an invisible magnetic sheath. No comet has a magnetic sheath, but machines can. The telemetry spike that followed hit sensors across 5 observatories at once. A sudden, synchronized surge of soft X-ray emissions emanated from the core, followed by a dip. Sharp, identical, repeating. The jet responded in rhythm, its brightness rising and falling like the output of a device receiving commands. The internal field of 3i Atlas was not just active, it was communicating, internally, structurally, with itself. And then came the final anomaly of the night. The beam rotated, not the nucleus, not the coma. The beam itself pivoted like a fixed spotlight, mounted to something that could only be described as a gimbal. A tiny offset, barely measurable, but unmistakable. Natural jets can wander, but they do so sloppily, irregularly. This motion was deliberate, coordinated, smooth. The jet wasn't attached to a random fissure in the ice. It was attached to something that could move. As the rotation settled, the jet aligned with a specific target, an invisible point in the heliosphere that no one had noticed until the tracking data was overlaid with deep space network readings. The beam was pointing directly at a region just ahead of the object's trajectory, an empty patch of space with nothing in it. Nothing anyone had detected. But maybe 3i Atlas saw something else. For 2 minutes the beam remained locked onto that invisible point. Bright, thin, perfectly straight. Then, just like that, it shut off. Instant, surgical, not fading, not dying, not sputtering. Just gone, like a switch flipping to off. And the moment it vanished, the coma snapped back to life, expanding outward as if whatever controlled the beam had released its focus and allowed the natural physics of sublimation to take over. The object went back to looking like a comet. But everyone watching knew better. The jet hadn't been a vent, or a plume, or a random burst of energy. It had been a test, a sampling, a signal, a calibration, a weapon, or maybe something we don't even have a word for yet. 3i Atlas had shown us what it could do when it stopped pretending to be a rock. And the question now wasn't what the jet was. It was who or what was it aimed at? The jet did something no cometary jet should ever do. It stopped. Not gradually, not by fading, just stopped. The thin, needle-like beam that had carved a razor-straight line across millions of kilometers suddenly went dark, as if someone had closed a shutter deep inside 3i Atlas. And in the seconds after its disappearance, the entire coma reacted like it had lost the one force that was holding it in alignment. The dust shell rippled outward, scattering in asymmetric bursts that looked more like shock waves than natural venting. Instruments across the deep space network lit up with motion alerts. But the silence didn't last. A glow returned. Not a beam this time, but a pulse, radiating from the exact point inside the nucleus where the directed jet had originated. It flickered once, then again, then stabilized into a heartbeat-like rhythm. Each pulse was sharp, clean, perfectly spaced. Each carried a spike in energy flow that rose through the layers of the nucleus like a waveform climbing a ladder. And then the jet returned. But not forward this time. It fired sideways. A thin, flawless line of light shot laterally across 3i Atlas's equatorial ridge, slicing through its own dust envelope with surgical precision. For several seconds the jet hovered in a horizontal plane, neither bending nor widening, as if bound by invisible rails. Then it rotated, slowly, smoothly, deliberately. It was scanning. The beam passed across its own expelled debris, interacting with particles that had been drifting without purpose moments before. But now those particles responded. They aligned. They vibrated. They illuminated like dust suspended inside a laser grid at a physics demonstration. The jet swept through them, leaving geometric patterns, spirals, arcs, lattices, as though mapping the dynamics of its own environment. Scientists couldn't process it fast enough. A separate burst of radio echoes triggered every spectrograph in L2 orbit. The echoes weren't random. They mirrored the scanning motion of the lateral beam almost perfectly. A matched pattern, a paired signal. The jet wasn't alone. The nucleus was talking to it. As telemetry teams scrambled to isolate the frequency, the jet began shifting through wavelengths, from visible light to near-infrared, from IR into ultraviolet, from ultraviolet into something the detectors labelled only as unknown coherent band. It was tuning itself. Whatever this beam was, it had modes, settings, like a device designed to adapt to the environment by switching frequencies until it found the one it needed. At the same moment, the coma began compressing, not collapsing, compressing, like a sphere of dust being drawn inward toward the axis of the jet as though responding to a magnetic funnel. And then the real shock hit. The beam didn't diffuse as it crossed the coma. It bent. Not slightly. Not in the gentle curve caused by dust refraction. It bent in a fixed angle like light passing through an engineered lens. Measurements confirmed it. The bending angle held steady at 42.6 degrees, the exact same angle seen in several of 3I Atlas's internal refraction anomalies weeks earlier. The jet wasn't just reacting to the coma, it was interacting with an internal optical system, a hidden structure guiding the beam from within. As the beam rotated further, it struck a small outflow plume, and instead of scattering, it split. Cleanly, sharply, into two identical beams. A bifurcation event. Impossible in nature, routine in directed photonics. Two razor-thin lines emerged from a single source, diverged at a mathematically perfect 60-degree angle, then twisted around each other like braided wire. Dust inside the braids aligned in spiral formations, creating interference rings visible even to naked eye simulations. Every instrument confirmed the same chilling thing. 3I Atlas was performing beam steering. The comet was controlling the direction, wavelength, and distribution of its jet as though operating a scaled photonic system. But the moment that broke every model came next. Just as the twin beams crossed the outer coma, the nucleus emitted a micropulse, almost unnoticeable, and both beams snapped forward into a single unified needle again, and then locked onto a target. Not random space, not the Sun, not Jupiter, Earth. Not directly, but toward Earth's orbital vector. A perfect alignment. A straight line from the core of 3I Atlas to the point Earth would occupy in exactly 11 days. Even the leading analysts went silent. Every previous jet event had been chaotic, pressured, unintentional. But this, a clean alignment onto a future position, this was deliberate navigation, intentional tracking, a directed line-of-sight calibration. And then, for the first time, the beam pulsed in binary. One long pulse, two short, one long, then nothing. Then the jet went dark as if someone had switched the entire system off mid-operation. The coma expanded in a slow exhale, drifting outward like a shell shedding tension. But the core remained bright, a faint persistent glow pulsing in silence. Whatever 3I Atlas had just done, it wasn't random. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't environmental. It was procedural, controlled, algorithmic. As if the jet wasn't a jet at all. It was a tool with a purpose. And the space agencies now had to face the question they'd spent months avoiding. If this beam wasn't shaped by pressure but by design, then who or what built the system that created it? And more urgently, why had it just traced a path toward Earth? Something inside 3I Atlas was no longer hiding. Something inside was calibrating. Something inside was preparing. The jet had acted not like a flare but like a measurement, a test, a probe. The silence that followed wasn't comforting. It felt like the kind of silence before a machine decides what it will do next. The jet had not widened with distance. Instead, it had become sharper. Hours after the first images were released, new telemetry from the Las Palmas optical array revealed something borderline absurd. The jet's diameter, no wider than a city street, remained constant across thousands of kilometers of space. Not dispersing, not fading, not ballooning like vapor under solar light. It extended like a filament, tight, unwavering, impossibly straight. NASA analysts tried atmosphere-free dispersion models, But they failed. They tried charged particle containment models, but the simulated beams collapsed after a few hundred kilometers. They tried magnetic confinement models, but the energy cost exceeded anything a natural comet nucleus could generate. Yet 3I Atlas held the beam steady. The impossible part wasn't just the confinement, it was the direction. As the object rotated, the jet did not drift, it did not twist, it did not arc with the rotation of the nucleus. Instead, the beam pivoted. It pivoted to stay fixed on a direction in space, not following the spin, not obeying inertia, but maintaining a deliberate orientation as the body turned beneath it. Just like a stabilized antenna, just like a tracking system, just like a device that was targeting. No one said the word officially. But everyone watching the raw feed understood what the behavior suggested. The jet wasn't venting, it was aiming. As the hours passed, ESA's deep field sensors detected faint fluctuations along the beam, tiny ripples, periodic, repeating every 43.2 seconds. These ripples travelled down the length of the jet like pulses moving through a wire, not waves of gas, not thermal variations, information. The beam was carrying information, and whatever it was pointing at had not yet revealed itself. Then the infrared arrays caught something even stranger. Each time a pulse travelled down the beam, 3I Atlas's nucleus dimmed, just slightly, like energy was being rerouted internally. But the moment the pulse exited the tip of the jet, the brightness returned. A cycle, a routine, a rhythm. The jet wasn't simply a beam, it was behaving like part of a larger system, a transmitter built on top of an object that should not have any mechanism at all. By the time Earth completed one rotation, the signal packets travelling down the jet had tripled in frequency. The beam tightened further, its outline sharpened to a needle-fine rail of light so coherent it seemed carved into space. And that's when the first reflection appeared. A faint echo, barely measurable, returned along the same path the beam travelled. Not from dust, not from plasma, from something out there responding. The reflection hit 3I Atlas's surface. The nucleus flickered. A wave of heat blossomed across the comet's midsection like a heartbeat responding to a whisper. The jet brightened. Its frequency climbed. The pulses accelerated. 3I Atlas adjusted its orientation, micro-degrees at a time, chasing the returning echo with surgical precision. It wasn't just transmitting anymore. It was locking on. NASA didn't announce this part. The frames showing the reflection were quietly removed from the public-facing repository, replaced with a corrupted file placeholder, but the raw logs leaked. Frame by frame, analysts studying the reflection noticed an unnerving consistency. The returning echo was not natural. It had structure, peaks, intervals, a periodic signature, almost like a handshake, almost like something out there had answered 3I Atlas in its own language. The beam thickened, only slightly, but enough for every deep space observatory to notice. The pulses began to modulate in stepped intervals, like code shifting into a new mode. Then the targeting angle changed, not by accident, not by drift. A sudden correction, 0.03 degrees, followed by another 0.03 exactly 10 seconds later. A pattern, a calibration, and finally, the jet stopped pointing into empty space. It settled on a very specific coordinate, a point deep beyond Neptune's trailing vector, a region with no planets, no known objects, no recorded bodies of any kind, a dead zone. Yet 3I Atlas stared at it like it was waiting for the dark to blink. Every instrument aimed at the jet confirmed the same terrifying truth. Something out there, something invisible, had just sent a signal back, and 3I Atlas was answering, not randomly, not mechanically, with intent. The directed jet had stabilized into something almost surgical, not flaring, not venting, not behaving like anything the solar system had ever produced on its own. It held its shape like a beam, razor-thin, unnaturally coherent, as if bound by rules no natural plume could obey. And deeper analysis began exposing something far stranger. The jet wasn't just leaving 3I Atlas, it was listening. Every time the beam sliced through the thin plasma around the object, the particles along its edge rippled in a perfectly uniform harmonic, tiny shifts in ionization that behaved less like outgassing noise and more like feedback, A return signal, a diagnostic, a response. Almost as if the jet was probing the space ahead of it. NASA's pattern team ran correlation models on the microfluctuations, expecting randomness. But what returned was a structure, a repeated harmonic sequence buried inside the turbulence. Not noise, not drift, a scan line. The realization hit the room at once. The jet wasn't projecting, it was mapping. Something ahead of the object, something invisible to telescopes, was being sampled, measured, analyzed. The beam was touching it, tracing it, reacting to it. And with every pulse, the jet grew sharper, thinner, almost unnervingly perfect, as though 3i Atlas was refining the tool it needed to study whatever waited in front of it. But what came next was the moment that forced every space agency into a silent, breath-held freeze. For 6 full seconds the jet bent. Not with solar wind, not with gravitational pull. It bent deliberately, toward a specific point in space 1/2 degree above its previous trajectory. A movement no natural jet should be capable of. The cameras caught every frame. The beam curved like a controlled instrument, adjusted with calculated precision, then snapped back into perfect alignment. And for the first time since this object entered the solar system, the directed jet didn't look like part of a comet. It looked like an arm reaching for something. Scientists on 3 continents whispered the same question. What did it detect? Spectrographs recorded a micro delay in the returning plasma signature. Not enough to identify an object, but enough to prove the jet had touched something with mass, or something with field density. Something we couldn't see. Something close. The jet thinned again, now almost needle-like, and began pulsing faster. Each pulse was so precise it could have been clocked with a metronome, spaced at intervals so consistent they formed a perfect mathematical grid. And then the unthinkable happened. The beam fractured. Not like a break, like a prism splitting light. One jet became 3. Thin, symmetrical, spaced like the tines of a tuning fork. The trio swept through space with a synchronized vibration so pure that every sensor monitoring the region filled with harmonic interference. 3 beams, 3 vectors, all converging on the same invisible point ahead of the object. This was no longer an outgassing plume. This was a system activating. The beams stitched across empty space in silent arcs, measuring, triangulating, confirming. They flickered with rising intensity, forming a narrow geometric scaffold, as if outlining the shape of something humanity had no words for. Then, as abruptly as they emerged, the beams remerged into one, a single, perfectly straight, impossibly coherent line of energy, pointing toward a region of space that, for now, remains dark. The directed jet steadied. Its glow deepened, its inner structure tightened like the iris of an eye adjusting for focus. And the truth was unavoidable. 3i Atlas wasn't firing a jet at random. It was targeting something precise, something known, something that had caused it to react with the most advanced level of control yet seen. A purpose, a destination, a signal. NASA never expected to see a comet aim. But this one was doing exactly that, and whatever it had just locked onto, it was getting ready to reach it. The jet sharpened again, so thin now it was less like a plume and more like a filament, a thread of precision threaded through the void. But the cameras weren't just tracking its brightness anymore, they were tracking its movement, and movement was the problem. Because this jet wasn't drifting, it wasn't wobbling, it wasn't behaving like vapor blown off the surface of a comet, it was tracking something. Each new frame made that harder to deny. Every few seconds the jet shifted a fraction of a degree, tiny, controlled, deliberate. Not a random dance, but a behavior, a decision, a correction. Almost like the tip of a compass needle trying to follow a magnetic line no one else could see. At first, scientists thought it was responding to solar pressure. Then they thought it was reacting to Jupiter's magnetic field. Then they blamed instrument lag. By the 4th correction, the room went silent. The jet wasn't reacting to anything external. It was adjusting before external forces arrived. Predictive motion. It was as if 3i Atlas had its own model of the solar system, one more accurate than any human simulation, and the jet was its pen, writing its path in real time. Even stranger, the jet didn't dissipate. It stayed narrow, tight, coherent, as though bound by an invisible sheath. Plasma physicists compared it to a fiber optic beam. Others compared it to a guidance laser. But one department quietly, cautiously, compared it to something else, a directional emitter, something used not for propulsion, not for cooling, but for communication. Nobody wanted to say that out loud, so they didn't. But the data kept pulling them back toward the same terrifying conclusion. This wasn't natural outgassing. This wasn't even behavior we could misinterpret as natural. The jet was aligning with a fixed point, a position just off the solar equator, empty, dark, unimportant. Until someone realized what was there, the space Voyager 1 had passed through almost exactly 12 years earlier. Why would 3I Atlas point at a patch of empty space? The question lingered, unanswered, as more data arrived. The jet began pulsing, not brightly, not dramatically. Just enough that the instruments caught periodic microflares, a sequence of tiny increases in luminosity, evenly spaced. It wasn't random. It wasn't a thermal twitch. It was a pattern, and not just any pattern. One used in pulse-modulated transmissions. The room tensed. Nobody moved. Every timestamp was checked and rechecked. The pulses were too precise, each one separated by the same interval, an interval that matched the earlier strange oscillations deep inside 3I Atlas itself. Internal cycles, external jet, perfect synchronization, like two parts of the same machine. And once the team plotted the jet's direction, everything got worse. The narrow filament wasn't pointing at random coordinates, it was pointing at a trajectory, one that didn't belong to any object currently in the solar system. But it did belong to something that had passed through more than a decade ago. Something humans had launched. Something humans had lost contact with once it entered interstellar space. Something drifting, blind, but still carrying our oldest, simplest message, Voyager. No one wanted to connect those dots. No one wanted to consider the possibility that this jet was not only directional, but addressed. The thin plume tightened again, its glow steadying like a signal locking into frequency. The beam then arced only slightly, just enough to compensate for the comet's rotation. That correction wasn't instinctive. It was deliberate. It kept the beam on target. And then the instruments captured a shift in energy composition. The jet was changing. The ions became more ordered. The velocity steadied. The spread narrowed. Microscopically at first, then measurably. It was refining itself, becoming more coherent, becoming more like a message. Spectral decomposition revealed something no one expected, a subharmonic repeating every 672 seconds. Not a frequency of plasma instability, not a resonance artifact, a carrier wave, one designed to ride on the jet itself. The room froze. The breath went out of every scientist in a single collective exhale. Carrier waves, someone whispered. Not random noise, not solar interference, a system, a structure, a transmission vector. The jet flickered one more time, and then the flare deepened just for a fraction of a second. Long enough to encode data, long enough to suggest the filament wasn't just directional, it was informational. The team watched as 3I Atlas steadied the beam and fired off another perfectly timed pulse. Then another, each one in the same direction, each one identical, each one aimed at the same path Voyager once took. Whatever was happening, it wasn't coincidence. It wasn't geology. It wasn't physics as we know it. It was choice. A quiet technician broke the silence, voice shaking. Is it calling something? But another question rippled through the room, a far worse one, unspoken but undeniable. Or is it answering? The filament brightened. The beams stabilized. And 3I Atlas held its aim, unwavering, as though waiting for a reply from the darkness beyond the heliopause. Whatever this directed jet was, thruster, emitter, scanner, or signal, it wasn't for us. It was for something out there. Something that knows this path. Something that has travelled it before. Something that might now be listening. And as the jet held its line, one final realization struck everyone watching. We were never meant to see this.